Welcome, champions. We've knocked off a tier list for seats 1 and 2, so you know what's coming. It's time to give a deeper look into the champions sitting in the 3rd seat and rank them in a good old tier list. While seat 1 focused almost exclusively on supports, and seat 2 heavily focused on healers, seat 3 is a healthy mix of tanks, a couple DPS, and some supports. As is tradition, let's begin with the native sitter of the seat, our core champion Nayeli, a lawful good human paladin, giving us our first core champion tank. For those of my viewers who have played Diablo 2, she's an Oradin. Like many core champions, she has a very simple kit that's easy to understand to introduce you to how this game handles positional abilities. Hers in particular increases the damage of those in the column behind her with Aura of Courage. Unlike many core champions, she has a second buff with her Aura of Protection. This makes her slotting capability a bit strict. The reason for that is she buffs all champions in the formation based on how many enemies are attacking her, or per each enraged stack, effectively forcing her to be in the very front of your formation. Being a tank, that's not so outlandish, but that also means your DPS has to be in the second column to receive both of the aura benefits. Her specialization is a choice between 2 oaths to swear, either the Oath of Vengeance, increasing the damage bonus of Aura of Courage, or Oath of Devotion, increasing her personal health by 70, which scales with her upgrades. Something to note about Nayeli's health is, like all other tanks in the game, other than the nerds, she eventually increases the health of all champions by 25% of her own health. Therefore, taking this specialization effectively increases the entire formation's health. As you'll often hear me say, the primary focus you should always have is increasing your DPS's damage. So more often than not, you will take her damage buff. But there will be scenarios where increasing her health via her specialization will be useful. Her numbers aren't terrible, but they're nothing fancy either. She's a serviceable tank, but she also doesn't really have anything that makes her excel as a tank. She is basically the gatekeeper of the C tier, not getting into B, but so high enough in C that anyone slightly better than her is going to slide into B. Going down alphabetically now, we're led to Artemis, the lawful evil human rogue, the current meta for DPS champions in this game, meaning what is currently considered the best. Something to know about me, I'm not a fan to clinging to a meta for no other reason than it's the meta. Now don't get me wrong, if that's what you like to do, you do you. But for me, in most games I play, I actively go against a popular meta just so I can try to outperform meta users. But that's really in like MMOs or fighting games. It's a little harder to do in a game like this where basically everything comes down to numbers. But if you never go against a meta, you'll never discover something new. And you might think that's funny coming from someone who still uses Zorbu, who at one point was considered the meta. But the thing is I just enjoy Zorbu's kit, and I find him very freeing to slot in a formation. Unlike other powerful DPS like Krond, Ashara, and Artemis, whose formations are very restrictive. Which, let's just get back on track with. He is a very interesting one to put in a tier list. I'm just going to say it, he's sliding on into S tier's DMs. But it is with a warning. The game creators have shown their willingness to nerf those sitting at the top, so he may be due for a nerf bat to the face. But in his current position, he is the best damage dealer in the game once used correctly, and that's important. Given that, I personally don't use him as my main DPS simply because I haven't invested in him yet, or his supports, which I might do in the future just to make that transition because he is that good. But the thing is I don't find the type of formation required to make him shine very fun. Because if you are going to use him to his full potential, you are very limited in your formation options. And because of that, I'm half tempted to put him in A. But he's the best DPS in the game, how can he not be S? But while he's amazing, he does require that specific setup to pop off. But he still does have other utility he offers to the group. If you're curious about one of them, head on over to my Seat 1 video and how he massively increases the damage buffing potential of one of the already great champions, Orkira. So, what does he do that makes him so good? He copies the formation positional abilities from other DPS champions in the formation with Observance, at a higher rate than usual, even if he is already under the effects. There's a lot of important information there, so let's break it down. First of all, the terminology positional formation abilities is important because, well, let's take Nayeli for example. Even though they can't be used together because they share a seat, her aura of courage applies to those behind her, i.e. positional, while her aura of protection is all champions. Their position doesn't matter. So if Artemis could be used with Nayeli, he would only observe aura of courage, not aura of protection. Only the one with a positional requirement. Secondly, he only copies from DPS champions, and this is where he becomes so restrictive. This means you want to maximize the number of DPS champions in the group who are also positional buffers, and you want those buffs to be on as many of those DPSers as possible, because he will copy from all of them. And yes, he has an equipment slot dedicated to buffing observance, effectively buffing everyone's formation abilities. The problem here is that there are only so many DPS who also serve as supports that also have positional formation abilities, so he hugs them tightly. These include the nerds, Krydal, Dadius, Cadibri, Makos, Birdsong, Orisha, Zorbu. Though you won't often use all of them, you're usually going to need a tank as well, so you'll want someone like Briv, who buffs everyone behind him, giving that buff to every single DPS for Artie to observe. Cadibri in Seat 7 is the only one I'm going to dive a little deeper into, as we'll get to all of the others when it's their respective seat, but Cadibri is directly tied to one of his specialization choices, so she's worth explaining. For simplicity's sake, she has a stacking buff for everyone in front of and including her, so excellent for Artemis, as depending on the formation and what you're running, it will be ideally applied to every single DPS in the formation. Now, his specialization choices are between a 10% buff for positional formation abilities copied from those adjacent to him, multiplicatively, or 25% for those copied directly from Drizzt and Cadibri. Drizzt is honestly out of the picture as he isn't a support, he's only a DPS. And he's in a seat where two different positional formation ability wielding DPSers are, Makos and Birdsong. So essentially you have to determine if you have Artemis adjacent to enough DPS gaining formation abilities to fully observe from, or just rely on Cadibri's 25% and make sure she's rocking all of the formation abilities to observe. His ultimate scales his damage based on how many DPS champions are currently in your formation, and makes him attack every time another DPS attacks. And this ult is actually amazing, since instead of relying on Bud damage, you're just making your damage dealer hit harder and faster, and he will actually make your Bud damage spike for other ults to benefit from, or if you want to use a Fire Breath potion after. On top of everything, he's also available for every patron, but he can also be hindered within them since he might not have access to all of those ideal DPS supporters. Oh, I also forgot to mention his ability, Jeweled Power, which gives him a stacking buff to his damage every time he gets a kill, which will randomly be consumed to hit even harder. The chance of it proccing also scale with the amount of kills. Most on-kill mechanics like this are kind of useless at your wall, but with this one you can go back to where weaker enemies are, farm it up a bit, and carry it over into a new zone. Overall, he's a great champion mechanically and aesthetically with a unique niche that actually works. He's very hard to get rolling until your roster opens up, but if you're at that point, he is well worth it. He even has some shenanigans with Observe you can make use of, like Omega boosting shields through his observance to effectively make him a sustainable tank. But yeah, when used right, I can't deny his potential. S tier, baby. Might even start to focus on him just because he is so strong, and there's a point where you're just hindering yourself if you don't use someone as strong as him. But again, the warning remains, he does take a lot to get going. Now on to a much simpler champion, Binwin, F tier, moving on. I'm kidding, though he's not going to be ranked very high. He did get a little love recently in some raw number increases, but nothing crazy. But also Rhea now buffs lawful good champions Horde, and he's one of the two damage dealers in that category as a lawful good dwarf barbarian / fighter. As a DPS, he's oddly reliant on what other people in your formation are doing. With his ability Extra Attacks, after a certain amount of attacks made by champions adjacent to him, he will then attack multiple times on his next attack, scaling his damage per attack. He also has the ability Extra Damage, which stores up additively based on how many champions adjacent to him land a killing blow before he attacks, and is expended when he does eventually attack. Yes, this is as strange as it sounds, a DPS that is reliant on other champions landing killing blows. The only even somewhat saving grace here is that it's kind of like Artemis's jeweled power. You can stack this up in a previous area and Binwin eventually increases this buff to maintain its potency when he doesn't land a killing blow. He also increases his damage based on how many shorties are active in your formation between the races Dwarf, Kobold, Halfling, Gnome, and Goblins. His ult is a simple AoE that slows, not terrible, nothing amazing. His specialization choices are between increasing the range of extra attacks and extra damage to 2 slots instead of just adjacent, or turning them into those not adjacent to him while also increasing his DPS by 400%. The biggest problem with this guy is even with all his buffs and all that, he's just flatline mid-tier DPS. And he's just clunky and complicated to set up a proper formation for. Why go through all that work when he's not even going to perform? With his multiple attacking utility, he can be squeezed into a niche of armor breaking, but ultimately he hovers between the high D and low C tier. I'll give him low C because anyone who knows me knows I like my dual-wielding berserkers. Next up is Brig, the chaotic good human bard/rogue. He's all about hype, so much so that it's his only formation ability, and his entire kit is tailored toward ramping that up. Hype itself increases the damage of all champions in the formation based on how many stacks it has, and there are a lot of ways to increase its stacks, so let's fire them off. Rallying Cord increases the stacks by 5 if an enemy has been defeated within 10 seconds, but alternatively increases the stacks if no enemy has been defeated by 1 each time a unique champion attacks, up to 10. Inspired Bard increases hype stacks by 1 for each adjacent champion, and gains an additional stack for each of those champions that deal more damage than him. Siren's Chant. This is a very new and welcome addition to him. He gains a 200% multiplicative increase to hype for each member of the Sirens of the Realms active in your formation, between himself, Vlanya, and Orisha. Ariza? Thankfully, he does count as one if he's the only one in the formation from that affiliation, which is pretty likely to be perfectly honest. Critical Moment gives 1 hype stack for every 5 enemies on screen, rounded up, and 10 stacks if there's a boss in sight. Volume Up permanently increases the potency of hype, based on your entire game time's highest ever attained number of hype stacks. Let's go over how to do that real quick. There's probably a better way somewhere, but as far as I can tell, the highest you can get that cap to is 75. In order to achieve this, we want to use as many champions around him as possible. Take the specialization that makes anyone with less attack than him count for stacks, so we focus on making him deal the most damage. We want to maximize enemies on screen while also having a boss. And there are only so many bosses that summon that many adds, so let's go to the adventure Running of the Sars in the Tomb of Annihilation campaign. You don't want click damage going out, and you want to be high enough so that your formation isn't actually killing anything, but can still survive the attacks incoming. Once you have all of this, pop his ultimate as well, which raises stacks by 11. And there you go, max stacks. If you know a way to get a higher number, please leave a comment. And I didn't mention Brig's other specialization, which increases his stacks for everyone in front of him. All in all, he's cool. But given the fact he focuses so hard on one buff, and that buff requires a lot to get rolling, and even then, it's good, not amazing, and he offers really no other utility at all to the group. I'd almost put him equal with Nayeli to be honest, but seeing as she is the gatekeeper to C, let's just say he slides right on into low B. And now we've got a turtle and a half shell, Gromma, the lawful neutral Tortle Druid. This turtle is a very rare combination of support, tank, and damage dealer. Those roles are specifically amplified by her specialization choices, which we'll just go straight into. The first is Circle of the Mountain, which makes her take half damage from ranged attacks and applies a stacking debuff to all enemies that land a hit on her. Then her Circle of the Arctic, which applies a debuff to enemies she attacks, slowing them and reducing their attack speed, as well as causing them to take more damage from all sources. That's right, that makes her an excellent pick for a click debuff formation. which in my book always bumps up a champion a tier for usefulness. Lastly, the Circle of the Swamp turns her attack into a level 2 spell, Melf's Acid Arrow, which makes it magical for mechanical purposes, hits harder, and deals AoE damage. Now, to be honest, she's probably not going to ever be your main DPS, cause she's mid-tier. And she might be decent for you early on, but she's just not amazing. But a serviceable tank, and her Circle of the Arctic in particular makes her a great support paired with her other tools. The main one being Grandmotherly Love, which increases the damage of all champions in proportion to their age, the younger the better. She also semi-mirrors Nayeli's aura of protection, increasing the damage of champions for each enemy attacking her, or each enraged stack, though at a higher percent, but only for neutral champions. Let's remember our boy Corazon, who allows any champion to receive neutral-based mechanics like this. And speaking of good boys, Gromma's wisdom is over 14, so she's nrackable as well. Her ult serves as some decent mob control, putting up a temporary wall that halts the progression of enemies momentarily. Given her adaptability, great support utility, as well as being a debuffer, I personally believe Gromma to be a rock-solid A-tier champion. Harumphing on in now is Mehen? Mehen? The neutral good Dragonborn fighter. He fills the roles of support, and kinda gold find. As far as where to position him, think of him as a mirror of Donner from the Seat 2 video. While Donner is a copper Dragonborn with a sword that buffs everyone in his column and behind. Mehen, the bronze Dragonborn with a sword, buffs everyone in his column and ahead. Now his buff, Grumpy, isn't quite that simple though. Like Brig's hype, it has stacks that rise and fall based on certain events. But unlike Brig, you don't want to maximize it. You want it to hover in the middle, shown by an indicator above his head. He gains 1 stack every second, increased by 1 for every column further back he is. Now ideally you want him as far back as possible, as eventually he gets gruff, which increases the effect of Grumpy for how far back he is compared to who he's buffing. So optimally, you want your DPS in the second column and him in the furthest back. So, how do you remove stacks to stay in that middle range? First, let's look at his affiliation and future formation ability that speaks to his entire purpose of the game. He belongs to the Brimstone Angels affiliation, which is the same name as his formation ability, which involves his 2 foster daughters, the twins Havilar and Faraday? Farida? Fajita? God, I'm hungry. Anyway, Havilar is in seat 10 and is a great support and decent tank. And Farida is in seat 7 and serves as a DPS. We won't dive fully into their kits yet, we'll get to them later. But without using them, honestly Mehen isn't that good. With them he's not bad, but he's still not the greatest. But by using them you make his Grumpy much more serviceable, as stacks are reduced each time one of the 3 attacks, takes damage, or gets a kill. With his ult, he leaps into the fray and breathes a cone of lightning damage to all enemies currently on screen. His Grumpy stacks are set at 50, right dead in the middle, and they gain and lose at 10% of the normal rate for 30 seconds, which helps when you need to center that buff for the right time. Oh, and that Brimstone Angels flat increases the effect of Grumpy for each daughter slotted in the formation, stacking multiplicatively. So basically, never use Mehen bare minimum without Havilar at least supporting another DPS, or use all 3 of them together. Also, that minor gold find I was talking about is Found Family, which increases the gold find of your group for each slotted tiefling, which he can count for with his feat, Adoptive Father, which just makes him count as a tiefling. Useful for race restrictions or if you're using his daughter Farida as a DPS since she scales with tieflings. His ult choices are between increasing the stat gains and effect of Grumpy, or increasing the effect of Found Family. And more recently, he gained a third, which is quite unique. He can choose to allow the use of his daughters in the formation even if they were otherwise restricted because of variance or patron rules. By himself, I'd honestly give him a D. He really just isn't good without the use of his daughters. Balancing Grumpy is hard to do without them, and even when it is balanced, its numbers don't bump all that high without them. Farida isn't a particularly high-tier DPS, but she's decent, and I do find her kit fun, and I believe she has potential if you focus her, but Havilar is useful for many situations, and is a good tank and great support. Within the niche of using him with Farida and Havilar, he might be considered a B, but I'm going to put him in high C for what he overall offers to the game. The addition of that third specialization really does help with his raw utility. But is it really enough to breach Nayeli, the gatekeeper of C? I don't know, man. Tell me what you think in the comments. In my opinion, it isn't. Next in line is Omin, the lawful neutral half-elf cleric with the gold and support tags. And he's pretty decent at both. Early on, he gets Shadow Counsel, increasing the damage of champions adjacent to him, but is very adaptable, since it's altered and increased based on his specialization choices. First, he changes it to those not adjacent to him and increases the effect by 85%. Second, he keeps it to those adjacent but increases it by 100%. Or more harshly, only those the furthest away from him, but is increased by 125%. They are honestly all so close it really just becomes where he best fits in your current formation and choose the specialization accordingly. He also gains Champion of Tymora, wherein every time he attacks, he blesses champions adjacent to him, making them a Champion of Tymora as well, increasing their damage for 3 seconds. All champions of Tymora spread the buff when they attack, so you'll see the buff spread, fall off constantly. But for each active champion of Tymora, you will also increase the effect of Shadow Counsel. You can try to better maintain Champion of Tymora through his known associates, where any member from Acquisitions Incorporated or the C team will have the duration doubled. But this isn't a requirement by any means. He also increases the uptime via his ultimate, where he summons a bunch of spirits that periodically explode and deal AoE damage, but also doubling the duration of Champion of Tymora on everyone, regardless of association, as long as there is still a spirit active. His gold find bonus comes in the form of contractual obligations, where he keeps track of those in the column in front of him. He takes note each time they attack, considering it a fulfillment of an obligation to him. Once he reaches 100 obligations fulfilled, he grants a hard gold find buff for 30 seconds, increased for how many champions are in that column in front of him. A perfect fit for an Azaka farm or good old gold find in general. And as we often need to bring up, he's got 18 wisdom, meaning he's rackable for that gold find buff as well. I think he fits into a solid mid-B rank, a decent buffer, but not the best, but great gold find. And finally we have Spurt, the lawful evil kobold rogue. This crafty inventor gives those adjacent to him a flat damage buff with his formation ability Centipede Net, as well as buffing the entire formation with Pack Tactics, a smaller buff that scales up depending on how many kobolds are in the formation, which will always count for 1 since Spurt is himself a kobold. His specializations are a simple choice between either increasing the range of Centipede Net by 1 slot, or increasing the damage buff of Pack Tactics. Basically, take the Pack Tactics increase, unless your formation does not allow Spurt to be adjacent to your DPS, in which case take the Centipede Net increase. Now, Spurt is also a debuffer with his formation ability Waspiration, which can be a little clunky. When he hits with his primary attack, wasps swarm that enemy until they are killed. When 4 enemies that have been wasped are killed, he invents a new random effect for 1 minute, with each effect being able to be stacked 5 times. His inventions come down to the form of 3 debuffs. Stingy, making enemies take 50% more melee damage per stack. Skunky, making enemies take 50% more damage from all sources per stack. And Grubby, making champions that attack the debuffed enemy attack faster per stack. You might think, sounds like it would take a long time to stack up all this stuff. And you'd be right, if it wasn't for his ultimate attack. We briefly covered Spurt's ultimate attack in the last video, where once you activate it, Spurt dies but remains in your formation as a spirit, and how that synergizes with 2 other champions in a unique way. But it does so much more than that. While Spurt is a spirit, champions that are adjacent to him will also apply wasps. So not only do you want him adjacent to your DPS, you want him adjacent to as many champions as possible. While a spirit, he also increases the damage of Centipede Net by 10% every 10 seconds, stacking 30 times. He also increases the effectiveness of Pack Tactics by an additional flat amount per active kobold. If there ever was a candidate to have a dedicated familiar to proc his ultimate as often as possible, it's Spurt. He is simply better in every way while in spirit form. Since today is the day of gatekeepers, I think Spurt is a prime example of a gatekeeper to be. not quite dipping into the A tier, but a really solid all-around champion once you get everything working as it needs to. And that's all she wrote for Seat 3. Don't forget to hit the like, sub, and bell, because I have more Idol Champion seat tier lists coming soon. I appreciate the watch and growing support from you all, as well as all the contention and the hearty disagreeers with my opinions. I highly encourage you either way to leave a comment. Let me know if you agree, let me know if you hate me, let me know what you think of my gatekeepers, everything and anything. Anyway, stay tuned. Have a hell of a time out there, champions. Hey, you guys still here? Good, because I've got a secret to share with you. Warning, this is a spoiler for the next champion. If you don't want to hear it, go on, get out of here. Go on, get. The next new champion releasing soon is for Seed 3. I can't exactly put them in a tier list as we don't have our hands on them yet. But we can talk about her kit, Nahara, the chaotic neutral bard/warlock. To start off, she's a hard DPS, but with the speed tag. So she will serve as our only source of speed in Seed 3. The speed comes in the form of to amuse or avenge, where when she attacks and defeats an enemy, she gains a levity stack, and when she attacks and does not land a killing blow, she loses one. She gets a damage bonus for each levity stack she has below the maximum. And when entering a new area, she will reduce the requirements to progress by an amount based on how high her levity stacks are. If this works in practice how it sounds, I'm guessing the best bet here will be to farm her up on the very first area to max her stacks, slotting in Shandy to get her dash buff up during this time. Then let your click damage carry you as far as you can go so you don't even give her a chance to lose levity stacks. I'm very curious to see to what degree this will be in combination with like Sentry and Human, but then once you reach your wall, she will start to lose those stacks and begin to deal more damage. I do kind of like the idea of the balance between either going faster or dealing more damage depending on what's going on. She will be encouraged to be in your progression formation as well via Who Am I?, where she gets a permanent small damage bonus for every area she completes, stacking additively and persisting through resets. She will also be viable for the Strahd Patron adventures no matter what, regardless of restrictions. On top of that, she also gains a damage boost for each member of the Black Dice Society affiliation, stacking multiplicatively. I have a bit of an issue with this, not because of the mechanic itself, but as we've gone over, Desmond, who is a Black Dice member, scales incredibly well with Blue Sheet and Spurt. Well, Spurt is C3, which will be Nahara's seat, so we won't get that. So we're already nerfing Desmond's full potential just by using her. I like synergy, but not at the cost of another synergy. It just seems so counterintuitive. But regardless, using her with Desmond and Tatiana will be ideal as they are the only Black Dice members currently. But I very much would expect for more to show up, as they've been very popular characters being added to the game all very recently. She will also have an ultimate that flat increases her damage for a short duration, and her specialization choices are between making Who Am I scale up faster, enhancing the Black Dice affiliation increase, while also allowing those members to be used regardless of restrictions if you're in Strahd's Patron adventures, which neither Desmond or Tatiana can be, so that's pretty useful. And lastly, increasing the area reduction bonus to Amuse or Avenge. I think she sounds interesting and has plenty of modifiers to her DPS, but her flat damage seems to be a bit low, so who knows. Only time will tell if she will actually function as more than just a speed buff. I look forward to her release, and I hope you do too. So, yeah, goodbye.